Parles-tu français? Hablas español? Parli italiano? If you've used Babbel, you would. Babbel's conversation-based techniques teaches you useful words and phrases to get you speaking quickly about the things you actually talk about in the real world. With lessons handcrafted by over 200 language experts and voiced by real native speakers, Babbel is like having a private tutor in your pocket. Start speaking with Babbel today. Get up to 55% off your Babbel subscription right now at babbel.com/Wondery. Spelled BABBEL.com/Wondery. Rules and restrictions may apply.
At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu.
He was going to argue to a judge, this is a mistake, I deserve asylum, I'm not a member of a gang. And he had his hearing set for Monday, the 17th, today, as we're recording this. But he was put on a plane, seemingly, and sent to El Salvador, and is, from all reports, currently languishing in a Salvadoran prison where Bukele is reportedly going to subject him to hard labor. He has gotten zero due process. Zero.
Welcome to Law and Chaos. Today, we're talking about immigration and the question of whether the president can ignore court orders thanks to his magical inherent Article 2 powers. Chief Judge James Boasberg says no. The DOJ says yes. We got a lot to cover, so let's get after it. Hey guys, I'm Liz Dye, and with me, as always, is Andrew Torres. Andrew, how are you?
Hey Liz, I am doing great. How are you?
I mean, it's a wild day. We listened to a lot of hearings.
Yes, we did.
Okay, we're going to spend the whole show today talking about immigration. We have an interview with Aaron Reichlin-Melnick, Senior Fellow at the American Immigration Council. But first, Andrew, let's talk about that wild-ass hearing we listened to this afternoon.
Holy moly, that was nuts.
Yeah. We are talking, of course, about the case of plane loads of Venezuelans being deported to El Salvador to be used as functionally slave labor in a grossly inhumane prison.
Yeah, immigration is such an important issue on its own terms, of course, but the Trump administration's legal posture in the immigration cases is such a vivid illustration of how this is going to go down in court for the next 4 years. Like, they're going to bend over backwards to find any Revolutionary War era law to justify whatever they're doing. And if they can't find a justification, they're going to do it anyway and bank on the Supreme Court bailing them out. But okay, let's talk specifically about this case, which is captioned J.G.G. v. Trump. We wrote about this yesterday on our Substack at lawandchaospod.com.
Nice plug.
And, of course, we discussed it with our guest. Everything started on Friday when the president signed a proclamation titled Invocation of the Alien Enemies Act regarding the invasion of the United States by Tren de Aragua. That's TDA. Well, it's reported that Trump signed that proclamation on Friday. He didn't date it or publicize it until Saturday. That was also an issue at the hearing. We're going to talk about it. But okay, look, TDA is a Venezuelan gang. And President Trump asserts the power to apprehend, detain, secure, and remove as alien enemies all Venezuelan citizens 14 years of age or older who are members of TDA, are within the United States, and who are not actually naturalized or lawful permanent residents of the United States. So 3 things you need to know about that proclamation. First, the administration claims that the president has the sole authority to determine who is in TDA and that his determination is unreviewable by any court. So if Trump says, hey, this guy's in a gang, then he is, even if objectively he is not. That is part of the ongoing campaign by this administration to just declare reality by executive fiat and demand that courts simply treat it as legally binding. Second, the proclamation excludes only those Venezuelans who have been naturalized or admitted as lawful permanent residents. So if you're here as a Venezuelan national on a temporary visa, a work visa, an education visa, or if you're seeking political asylum, as many of these plaintiffs are, because you're fleeing from persecution, you are subject to this proclamation. And third, The Alien Enemies Act is a 227-year-old statute. It is one of the literal Alien and Sedition Acts. It is almost certainly unconstitutional. And even if it's not, it applies only by its own terms during wartime, which this isn't. That is why Trump has this crazy, convoluted chain of argument where he says, these gang members are members of TDA. TDA has taken over the government of Venezuela, which it has not, and that this hybrid state has invaded the United States, which it also has not.
Yeah. Okay, so before we get into the legal machinations here, let's just take a second and remind ourselves that these Venezuelans are human beings, right? Here's a bit about the first named plaintiff, pseudonymously referred to as J.G.G. J.G.G. is seeking asylum, withholding of removal, and protection because he fears being killed, arbitrarily imprisoned, beaten, and tortured by Venezuelan police since they have done so previously to him. During an interview with ICE, he was detained because the officer erroneously suspected that J.G.G. was a Tren Aragua member on account of his tattoos. J.G.G. is a professional tattoo artist, and his two tattoos, a rose and skull on his leg, which cover a monkey tattoo that he no longer liked, and an eye with a clock inside it, which a fellow tattoo artist applied as practice, are not associated with Tren Aragua. While he was awaiting a hearing on the merits of his applications for protection in Adelanto, California, J.G.G. was awakened at 2 a.m. on March 6, 2025, and told that he was being released and that he had to sign documents that were available only in English to receive his property. J.G.G. then signed documents under false pretense. Instead of being released, J.G.G. was abruptly and without explanation transferred to El Valle Detention Center in Texas. While in El Valle, he was awakened at 3 a.m. on March 14, 2025, and told without explanation that he was going to be transferred elsewhere. So to be clear, that's the administration saying, oh, this guy has tattoos and he's from Venezuela, so he's probably in a gang, and yay, we now get justification to deport him.
Yeah. Good thing no one legally in this country has tattoos.
Yeah.
Okay. Now let's talk about the deportations, because they're especially awful. Trump negotiated to hand these immigrants over to El Salvador's president, Nayib Bukele, who describes himself as the world's coolest dictator. In 2023, Bukele built a 40,000-person capacity mega prison called the Terrorism Confinement Center, or CCOT. I will let the Associated Press describe it. Prisoners here do not receive visits. There are no programs preparing them for reinsertion into society after their sentences, no workshops or educational programs. Each cell holds 65 to 70 prisoners. Steel walkways cross atop the cells so guards can watch prisoners from above. The prison does have dining halls, break rooms, a gym, and board games, but those are for guards. Prisoners sit in rows in the corridor outside their cells or are led through exercise regimens under the supervision of guards. They are never allowed outside. So if you're thinking this is the Guantanamo Bay playbook, this is the Guantanamo Bay playbook, right? That sort of treatment would absolutely be considered cruel and unusual punishment in violation of the Eighth Amendment if we did it on American soil. So the Trump administration is outsourcing inhumane treatment of immigrants to an autocrat who does not answer to any authority in this country or his own. In practical terms, that means that once planes touch down on foreign soil and these immigrants are turned over to foreign authorities, it's a fait accompli. It's done. It cannot be undone by any court.
Right. So the plan to invoke the Alien Enemies Act had been in the works for a while, and it was widely expected by immigration advocates. But Axios reports that the administration deliberately had Trump sign the order on Friday, but not release it until Saturday so he could scoop up these poor Venezuelans for deportation without tipping off immigration advocates. Once word got out, the ACLU and Democracy Forward ran to court on Saturday to file a complaint seeking immediate injunctive relief to stop these deportations. They drew Chief Judge James Boasberg, who granted 2 temporary restraining orders. The first ordered the government not to deport the 5 named plaintiffs, and the second certified a nationwide class of all non-citizens in U.S. custody subject to Trump's proclamation about Tren Aragua, and it prohibited the administration from taking any adverse action against those people.
Yeah, and I want to unpack the timeline here a little bit because this is really important to understand the duplicity that took place. Judge Boasberg convened a Zoom call at 6 p.m. on Saturday to rule on that class certification question that you just described, Liz. And he granted the certification and issued a nationwide TRO. At 6:48 p.m., Judge Boasberg very clearly ordered the government not to deport anyone subject to the proclamation. Here's what he said. You shall inform your clients of this immediately, speaking to the DOJ lawyer. And any plane containing these folks that is going to take off or is in the air needs to be returned to the United States. But those people need to be returned to the United States. However that's accomplished, whether turning around a plane or not embarking anyone on the plane or those people covered by this on the plane, I leave to you. But that is something you need to make sure is complied with immediately. And that is a legal order of court. Judge Boasberg didn't commit it to writing until issuing a minute order at 7:26 p.m. But when a judge says, turn those planes around immediately, you turn the goddamn planes around immediately.
Which they did not do. They did not turn the planes around. Indeed, from the pleadings submitted this morning, the government sent out at least 3 plane loads of deportees from Harlingen, Texas, in open defiance of those orders. Global X Flight 6143 departed at 5:26 p.m. Eastern Time, did not land until 7:36 p.m. It was in the air when both oral and written orders issued. Global Flight 6145 departed at 5:45 p.m. and did not land in San Salvador until 8:02 p.m. That was in the air when those orders were issued. And Global Flight 6122 did not even depart Texas until 7:37 p.m., almost an hour after Judge Boasberg said, turn those planes around. So obviously the government did not comply with the court's order. Instead, they appealed the TRO, although, as we've said, appeals of TROs are not a thing. And then this afternoon, they sent out a bizarre letter to the clerk of the D.C. Circuit demanding that the case be reassigned to another trial judge because Judge Boasberg is mean, which is, again, not a thing.
Yeah, I mean, if you want to do that, you can file a motion to ask the circuit court to reassign the case, right? Like we talked about that with respect to Eileen Cannon in the 11th Circuit. But like, you're not going to get it done by writing a pissy letter.
Yeah, I'm not sure what the point of that exercise was. They also complained that the district court may force the government to disclose sensitive national security and operational security concerns or face significant penalties from the court. The government cannot and will not be forced to answer sensitive questions of national security and foreign relations in a rushed posture without orderly briefing and a showing that these questions are somehow material to a live issue.
Ooh, I think we call that foreshadowing.
I mean, I think we call it put that shit into motion. I dare you, asshole. And by the way, since we're a Name and Shame podcast, the lawyer who put his name on that garbage motion is Drew Ensign.
Yeah. Boo. Shame.
Shame.
So, obviously, the ACLU has filed an emergency WTF motion.
Yeah, is that the technical term for it?
It is these days. Here's what they said. That phrasing, describing the lack of compliance by the government, strongly suggests that the government has chosen to treat this court's order as applying only to individuals still on U.S. soil or on flights that had yet to clear U.S. airspace as of 7:26 p.m., the time of the written order. If that is how the government proceeded, it was a blatant violation of the court's order. Whether or not the planes had cleared U.S. territory, the U.S. retained custody at least until the planes landed and the individuals were turned over to foreign governments. They're right. And again, that was something Judge Boasberg made crystal clear during the oral ruling, right? So I'm going to quote from him again. Again, just so we are clear, if planes have already landed and discharged their occupants, aside from the 5 plaintiffs I enjoined earlier, then this order, I don't have jurisdiction to require their return.
Okay. So now this case, which was already about immigration, has become about 2 important things, not just one, right? We are talking about whether the president can just point to any foreign national, call him a terrorist, and summarily deport him, obviously. And we're talking about how judges are going to deal with the government when it is in more or less open defiance of court orders. So toward that end, we're going to unpaywall Andrew's post from yesterday with the background information on the Alien Enemies Act, since we do not have time today to recap it.
I wish we did. And also, if you are a subscriber on Patreon at patreon.com/lawandchaospod or on Substack at lawandchaospod.com, you will get an extended discussion of the only Supreme Court case interpreting the Alien Enemies Act of 1798. It's a case called Ludecky versus Watkins. And the question is either the D.C. Circuit or the Supreme Court, relying on that case, going to say that Trump has unreviewable power to deport anyone he wants pursuant to the Alien Enemies Act? And I think the answer is maybe. Right. This case is really, really bad, Liz. And, we're going to dive into the legal arguments in the subscriber bonus in more depth than we did in the written post. Like, I think if you're a listener, you're really going to appreciate the discussion.
Okay. And everyone else will get to spend some quality time with our advertisers. But first, thank you to our new patrons at patreon.com/lawandchaospod. Thanks to NATO Republic, Amy O'Leary, Brandon P., and Elio McCabe. And to our new subscribers on Substack at Law and Chaos Pod, Nelson, Matthew Hoyles, and Christina Nascimento. And thanks to our upgrading subscribers, Mary L., Rob, Amy Therese Perhak, Dan Rollins, Jamie Y., Random, Janelle, Nancy L. Buck, Jesse Myers, Stefan, Jonathan Dalton, Loretta Abdo, Logan Bacon, Liz Morris, Nancy, Elizabeth Kidd, Nanti, Eric, Colin, Elizabeth Benke, and Jacob Matthews.
And finally, thanks to some more upgrading subscribers, Ed Mulholland, Scott S., Beach Loafer, Ann Moss, Alexander Brown, Misha, Lucy, Sally Lunn, Gary L., Bradley, Trish Brait, Heather Riley, Kath N.C., William, Cheese and Kraken, nice, Ben Zickerman, Old Stage Guy, Milton Chambers, Jen, Sarah T., and January Claire. And if you would like a shout out, you know how to do that. Just head on over to patreon.com/lawandchaospod, subscribe at any level, or go to lawandchaospod.com and become a paid subscriber. Thank you so much. And for everyone else, we will see you on the other side of this ad break.
Okay, so before the break, we told you that the government did not turn the planes of migrants around, as per Judge Boasberg's order. Instead, it dumped these guys in that hellhole of a jail, and Salvadoran President Bukele tweeted the cry-laughing emoji smirking at the court's ruling, along with a video of the prisoners being abused, set to jaunty music, both of which were reposted by multiple members of the Trump administration, including Secretary of State Marco Rubio.
Yeah, it was so gross. At essentially the same time that this administration was, cry laughing about a human rights tragedy, it also submitted a notice to this court about its noncompliance with a court order. That notice began, federal defendants were promptly notified of this court's 7:26 p.m. minute order that temporarily enjoined any removals pursuant to the presidential proclamation. Federal defendants have sought emergency appellate relief from the D.C. Circuit as to both orders.
Yeah, two things. First, you cannot appeal a TRO. Again, not a thing. Second, note the slippage here. This is an effort to reframe the timeline and shift it 45 minutes into the future, right? Judge Boasberg did not rule at 7:26 p.m. He ruled at 6:45 from the bench. He told the DOJ lawyer arguing the case, Drew Ensign, to call his client immediately and turn those planes around. And he didn't say, wait for me to put it in writing and then do it.
Oh, if you're agitated now, just wait until you hear paragraph 2. So the government says, going forward, and in the absence of appellate relief, federal defendants will continue to protect the United States using authorities other than the proclamation. Federal defendants further report, based on information from the Department of Homeland Security, that some gang members subject to removal under the proclamation had already been removed from United States territory under the proclamation before the issuance of the court's second order.
The United States territory, I think that would be the operative phrase here.
Yeah, that removed from U.S. territory is literal sovereign citizen level mouth noises, right? A court order to U.S. officials to turn around U.S. planes is effective no matter where that plane is, even if you're in international waters and even if there's no gold fringe on the flag, right? Like, think about that for a tenth of a second, right? Otherwise, you could murder people for free every time you took a cruise or boarded an international flight.
Right, which is why the plaintiffs responded on Monday morning with a filing that essentially said, hey, Judge Boasberg, it looks like the government just disregarded your orders. Mm-hmm. And they ended with a request that the government submit one or more sworn declarations from individuals with direct knowledge of the facts on 4 issues.
Yeah, and I just want to jump in and say the point of asking for this to be in the form of a sworn declaration is that that's under oath, right? Like, so it's not something you can kind of blow off as creative argument or zealous advocacy. If you lie in an affidavit, the plaintiffs can pursue Rule 11 and other sanctions. So that's why they want it in the form of a declaration.
Right. And that's why the lawyers here don't want to do that.
Yeah, right.
Okay. So what the plaintiffs asked for was the following information, right? They want to know, after the judge issued his order, whether any flights with individuals subject to the proclamation took off, right, after the written or oral orders were issued. Number 2, whether any flight with individuals subject to the proclamation landed after that. Number 3, whether any flight with individuals subject to the proclamation, that is the court order about Tren de Aragua, whether any of those individuals were still in the air after the court's written order, or number 4, whether custody of any individuals subject to the proclamation was transferred to a foreign country after Judge Boasberg, ordered in the court. And then on Monday, in a minute order scheduling the hearing, Judge Boasberg instructed the government to be prepared to provide answers to those questions when they hauled their keisters into court.
Yeah, don't faint, kids, but that did not happen.
No, it did not. Right. So there was a hearing at 5 o'clock, and right out of the gate, the new lawyer arguing on behalf of the administration, whose name is Abhishek Kambli, showed up with a script, and he kind of stuck to it. Right. Yeah. Despite being ordered to provide answers to the plaintiff's questions, he just didn't. He instead repeatedly insisted that the planes took off after Judge Boasberg's written minute order, that they contained no deportees subject to the TRO, and beyond that, he was not at liberty to mention anything publicly.
Yeah. If there's a judge that the government is going to bully by, barking national security like a trained seal, Judge Boasberg is not that judge, right? He was the chief of the FISA court for a decade, right? He knows his way around these issues. On Saturday, the government came in and said at that 6 p.m. class certification issue that it could not answer a question on the basis of national security. And Judge Boasberg was like, cool, what we're going to do is kick everybody off the phone, which they did for 8 minutes, and you can tell me out of earshot, and then we'll reconvene the hearing. And he did. And I have to tell you, Judge Boasberg was incredulous at the idea that the government might not be willing to explain why this was national security, that they didn't come with any of the information, that they wouldn't even tell him in camera, right? Let him kick everybody off the phone again. It was a lot.
Yeah, I mean, Kambli never even actually said that the info was classified. And I mean, even if he were, Judge Boasberg said, I'm willing to get a skiff. You come in here and you tell me what it is. And I mean, look, there's nothing that he's going to say that's going to undo the reality here, which is that Marco Rubio, President Bukele, all of these people were tweeting the video of these detainees out. So if you're coming in there and you're trying to argue that it's so national security sensitive that you can't talk about it even in camera to the judge, you're on a bad footing.
Yeah, that's right. So the government came prepared to offer no information, despite being ordered by Judge Boasberg to do so. Judge Boasberg then said, okay, fine, you have to submit a declaration to me by noon tomorrow, and we're going to take it from there. Again, I would have liked to have seen some sanctions slapped down, but, that didn't happen. What the government did come prepared to do was to argue about the case law, though. And they had a series of arguments, each more terrible than the last. So the first was they said, look, we complied with the written order. Oral directives are not enforceable. They were superseded when you put that down and memorialized it in writing. And Judge Boasberg was a little bit skeptical of that.
A little?
Yeah. He said, you're saying you complied with my order? And they said, well, we're saying we complied with the written order. And then Judge Boasberg said, right, but what about my oral orders? And that's when they shifted to argument number 2, which was the sovereign citizen. The planes are flying over international airspace. And Judge Boasberg was like, are you telling me that the equitable powers of a district court judge of the United States end at the nation's border? And again, Kambli was unwilling to answer that yes or no, because the answer to that is obviously not. Those powers do not stop at the border. It's just, incredibly obvious that, the government wouldn't take this position if say the court had revoked the passport of an ordinary criminal defendant, and then he snuck across the border to Mexico and his lawyer came to court and said, sorry, guys, my client's in Mexico. Nothing you can do about it. Screw off. The court would say, no, our relief applies, even if your client has fled the country.
Right. I think the most kind of terrifying argument here is that the administration takes the position that even if there was no Alien Enemies Act, or if, the preconditions of the Alien Enemies Act were not met, which again, they weren't, right? Trans-Aragua is not the actual government of Venezuela and the U.S. is not being invaded. But they're saying even absent the Alien Enemies Act, Trump has inherent authority under Article 2 of the Constitution to control all immigration and to point to any immigrant he likes and says, you out of the country right now and to kind of disappear them without any due process, which, Trump is known to say, I have an Article 2 and it's very powerful, which is funny and also not funny because this is what they're saying. They're basically saying he has unreviewable executive power and, you, the court, lack any jurisdiction to interfere with that at all.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I would make sort of two additional points. The first is this seems to be of a type with the USAID cases, right? And what the government said, which was once they were enjoined and the court said, no, you can't just suspend all foreign aid, they came back into court and said, okay, we haven't suspended all foreign aid. We have done a case-by-case review. We've looked at 6,000 contracts in the last 12 minutes, and we've decided that we have independent authority to suspend all of them, right? And I think that that's what the government is going to wind up doing here. They're going to come back in and retroactively classify all of these removal decisions that they initially undertook pursuant to the Alien Enemies Act and say, nope, we did those pursuant to, inherent Article 2 powers, even though those are not a thing.
Right. That's clearly where this is going to go. They're going to say all of these people that we put on planes and all of the people that we are going to continue to put on planes, that we did this pursuant to other things that we were not enjoined by this court. That's what they've done in, with respect to almost every one of these TROs. They've gone ahead and violated it and said, no, you told us we couldn't do it based on whatever authority, and we've done it based on a totally different authority. It's just a coincidence that we did it the same thing. I mean, we saw this in the Office of Personnel Management case where they said, well, no, we told all of these, every federal agency to fire all probationary employees and tell them that they were doing it for cause. But that was just advisory. The fact that they did it didn't have anything to do with our advice. And the court said, that's bullshit and enjoined it. But that's clearly what's going to happen here.
Yeah, and counsel for plaintiffs made the point that subject to the proclamation includes more than just the invocation of the Alien Enemies Act because of how Trump himself decided to, or whoever wrote it for him, decided to write this presidential proclamation. So it says, based on the made-up factual findings, and by the authority vested in me by the Constitution and laws of the United States of America, including 50 U.S.C. 21, that's the Alien Enemies Act, I proclaim that all Venezuelan citizens, et cetera. And so the point of that argument is that individuals can be subject to this proclamation and therefore covered by the TRO, prevented from being summarily deported out of the country, even if the government shifts its justification. And we're going to have to see how that plays out.
Yeah.
Okay, so at the end of that rather wild hearing, we have a declaration forthcoming from the government. Well, let me read very quickly the minute order that Judge Boasberg put into writing after remarking out loud, I guess I'm going to have to put this in writing since my oral orders don't seem to carry much weight with the government anymore. Anyway, here's what he put in writing. As discussed in today's hearing, the court orders that by 12 p.m. on March 18th, the government shall file a notice setting forth 1, a sworn declaration that no one on any flight departing the United States after 7:25 p.m. on March 15th, 2025 was removed solely on the basis of the proclamation at issue. 2, a sworn declaration setting forth when the proclamation at issue was signed, when it was made public, and when it went into effect. 3, the government's best estimate of the number of individuals subject to the proclamation currently remaining in the United States and how many are currently in U.S. custody. And 4, the government's position on whether and in what form it will provide answers to the court's questions regarding the particulars of the flights. That's what we discussed. Such form could include in-camera review or in a classified setting. If the government takes the position that it will not provide that information to the court under any circumstances, it must support such position, including with classified authorities, if necessary. So, yeah, this isn't going away anytime soon.
No, it is not. Okay, we're going to take another ad break, and then we're going to get to the interview with Aaron Reichlin-Melnick. And with us today is Aaron Reichlin-Melnick. He's a senior fellow at the American Immigration Council and a sharp critic of immigration policy under both Donald Trump and Joe Biden. Aaron, thank you so much for being here with us today.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's just get right into it. Donald Trump says he's going to deport tens of millions of people. 20 million people? It's a moving target, but is that a feasible thing? Is that real?
No. The logistics required to deport tens of millions of people would be unheard of. Now, of course, I don't want to rule anything out, but if you're looking at the kind of nation state that could carry out the deportation of 10 million people, you're looking at something more akin to Nazi Germany than anything that looks like what the United States looks like, even under the current administration. The logistics are simply not there to do anything like that. But that doesn't mean that they're not trying to send a message. And that message is you should self-deport. And it would be easier for us if you just pick up and leave because you're afraid we might come get you than if we actually have to come pick you up.
So can you talk, I think your point is really well taken on the hostile message that's being sent, but can you put a little meat on the bones in terms of the logistics, right? I mean, after all, we just saw overnight, to either beat or evade a court order in the J.G.G case, that the government take 300 people and stick them on a couple of planes. I mean, it seems like if you're dedicated enough, that a sufficiently evil administration might be able to deport millions of people.
Yeah, well, I mean, let's take the 300 people thing. Well, if you did 300 people a day, that adds up to 109,500 people a year. So at that rate, it would take you still about 10 years to deport 1 million people. So, okay, maybe you're doing 1,000 people a day. Well, that's 365,000 people a year, and it's going to take you 3 years to do 1 million people. And that gives you some sense of really what we're talking about in scale here. Mm-hmm. The highest number of internal deportations ever carried out in the United States in a single year. So that is people arrested by ICE inside the country, not people arrested at the border, attempting to cross, people who are already here, was 238,000 in fiscal year 2009 under President Obama.
Wow.
At that rate, it would take 46 years to deport 11 million people. So this is, when you just do the basic math of this, mm-hmm. you have to quintuple, sextuple. You've got to just increase deportations by 10, 15, 20 times to get anything near millions of people in a single presidential term. And while the Trump administration is certainly undergoing an effort to massively increase deportations, maybe to hit the Obama levels and reach higher than that, it still would take them decades to be able to actually physically deport millions of people, which is why they are attempting to essentially create this hostile environment so that people choose to go home on their own, the so-called self-deportation.
Is that, to your opinion, working? Right? Like, are we really seeing a tremendous number of self-deportees, as they like to put it?
It's almost impossible to track this because, the administration created, they took the CBP-1 app, which had been used under the Biden administration to help people schedule a process to enter the United States legally and seek asylum at the southern border, and changed it to the CBP Home app, where you are supposed to report your own self-deportations and, use that to facilitate leaving the country. I think one person so far has used that, according to the various reports. That this was a Columbia student that they moved to strip her visa for apparently failing to report that she had been falsely arrested for taking part in a protest at Columbia. Charges were dismissed. She said she had not actually protested anything. Nevertheless, she had her visa stripped as part of the Trump administration's ideological war on pro-Palestinian content. But I think she's the only person we know of publicly who's actually done that process. That is not to say that other people have not chosen to leave, but we won't have any data or statistics on that, and it will show up maybe later in the census. But so far, I think people are mostly just staying underground. There are extensive reports of children not going to schools, people not showing up for work, or people only showing up for work, going home and essentially hiding at home for the rest of the time, not taking part in civic life, not going to restaurants, ordering only takeout. So the effects of the fear are very real. Whether that has actually transformed into self-deportations is unclear at this point.
Let me ask you a sort of metaphysical question. Do you think that the deportations are the real goal, or do you think what they want is a sort of cowering, fearful class of people who can be sort of, not to say harvested, but used for these photo ops at will?
I think, yes, the deportations are a real goal. They are aware they can't do all of them, but they want to do as many of them as they can. And in fact, they have really transformed a lot of the US law enforcement apparatus into an arm of the mass deportation machine. The Department of Justice, the FBI, the DEA, the ATF, all of these federal law enforcement agencies have been ordered to assist ICE with deportations, to bring criminal prosecutions against migrants, because they are serious about this. On the other hand, they also know when you press them on it privately, and when occasionally they talk to the media off the record, that they are never going to hit the numbers they promised to hit. So I think they are also trying to create this fearful atmosphere so that they can not only rile up the base, let them know very publicly, we're out there, we're taking these bad guys out of your communities, even when these bad guys include one of the guys they sent to Guantanamo Bay. The only thing that he had done wrong was he had a ticket for riding a bicycle on the other side, on the wrong side of the road. But, facts aside, they want to create that atmosphere, and they really are trying to get these deportation numbers up.
Okay. So actually, since you bring it up, can we talk for a minute about the debacle of Guantanamo? Are they going to close it? What's going on here?
It remains unclear what, if anything, they're going to do with Guantanamo Bay. In total, several hundred people were sent to Guantanamo Bay. Initially, about 177 people were sent there, almost, I think, all Venezuelan, all who had final orders of removal. Some of them had criminal records, quite a lot. 1 in 3 did not have any criminal record whatsoever. And of those that had criminal records, some of that included things like that guy who had a ticket for biking on the wrong side of the road.
Right.
And so what they did with them is they put them on a plane and deported them to Honduras. And then the Venezuelan government came and picked them up from Honduras, and they were brought back to Venezuela. So they were essentially using Guantanamo Bay in that circumstance as like a transitional detention center. Again, mostly for the cameras, because there was no reason they couldn't have done that from the United States. You don't need to fly someone to Guantanamo Bay to fly them to Honduras. You can just fly them from the United States to Honduras. And so that was, again, mostly for PR. What seems to have happened since then, they brought some people back, some further people to Guantanamo, and then they actually emptied the base out and brought them back to the United States, is that pretty much everybody who was, I guess, had any sanity involved noted this is crazy expensive. This is logistically difficult. It's exposed them to a whole bunch of lawsuits. The facilities were clearly inadequate. They didn't satisfy ICE standards because these people were still technically under ICE custody. So as of today, no migrants are at Guantanamo Bay, other than the migrants who get picked up in the Caribbean and who have been brought to Guantanamo Bay for decades, to something called the Migrant Operations Center, which has been in operation since the Clinton years.
Oh, interesting. I think most people don't know about that.
Yeah, it was a much bigger deal in the 1990s when tens of thousands of Cubans and Haitians were held in Guantanamo Bay, who are all been interdicted in sea. But ever since then, any Cuban or Haitian migrant, or I suppose of any nationality interdicted, in international waters off Florida or Puerto Rico, is sent to Guantanamo Bay and processed there. They're not brought into the United States. So there was some facility already there for migrants, but not for migrants picked up inside the U.S. And some of the migrants the Trump admin sent to Guantanamo were not held there. They were held in Camp 6, the same notorious facility used to hold al-Qaeda terrorists.
Okay, Aaron, can you then talk about what happens to those migrants who are processed at Guantanamo? Because unlike the J.G.G. case that we're going to talk about, where there's sort of effectively no government oversight and no due process, as you mentioned, those folks, even though they're being held in Guantanamo Bay, they are in U.S. custody. They are under ICE supervision. Talk us through what happens. How are they processed there?
Well, from what we know about the Guantanamo cases, the first Venezuelans that were sent there all had final orders of removal already, which means that the U.S. government had already gone through a standard immigration law process and had declared them removable, and not only removable, but had ordered them to be removed.
I'm going to interrupt myself here, but why don't you give a minute or two on what you're describing as the standard immigration process, so just we know the baseline from which we can talk about the deviations.
Yeah, so there's really two main processes we're talking about here. The first one is the one that applies to a lot of people at the border, which is called expedited removal. In expedited removal, a single immigration officer really acts as, the judge, the jury, and at times even the executioner, which is expedited removal applies to recent migrants who have arriving in the United States or have been arrested inside the United States within 2 years of entry under how it's been expanded to the Trump admin. These people don't have the same rights as other migrants.
Is there still a geographic location? I know that used to be within 50 miles of the border.
There used to be. Until the Trump admin changed this recently, it was, anyone arrested within 14 days of entry and 100 miles of the U.S. border. Expedited removal now applies to any person encountered within the United States within 2 years of arrival. So there's no longer any geographical limit. And under expedited removal, you can ask for a screening for asylum. And, then you're supposed to get a credible fear interview. And if you fail that interview, then you get ordered removed. You have a final order of removal that's issued against you. And at that point, overturning that order is very hard to do. Federal courts almost have no jurisdiction to address that. But you do supposedly have this right to seek asylum, though I will note right now the Trump administration is outright ignoring it and just pretending that's not in the law because Donald Trump has declared there is an invasion and no migrant should be allowed to seek asylum. So setting that aside, the other option is removal proceedings in immigration court. And this is for anyone arrested inside the United States who's not subject to expedited removal or anyone who passes a credible fear interview. There, you have to go in front of an immigration judge. The immigration judge determines whether you are legally eligible to be removed. So, for example, you could say, I'm a U.S. citizen. I'm not eligible to be removed. And the immigration judge would say, yeah, someone's made a huge mistake here. Proceedings terminated. But normally most people, or you could say, for example, the reason the government argues that I should be removed, I have a green card, I did commit an offense, but it's not one of the offenses that falls within the category of things that you can get deported for. And that's, how a lot of lawyering goes on. The immigration judge will make a decision on that. Then if you are eligible to apply for some kind of relief from removal, that could be asylum, it could be some kind of waiver, you can go through that. There's a hearing, the judge issues a decision. That decision then can be appealed potentially all the way up to the Supreme Court. But at the end of the day, you either get a final order of removal or you get a decision saying you get to stay in the United States.
That makes sense. One more background question. You mentioned twice the credible fear interview as potentially removing you from the category of expedited removal to having the right to appear in an immigration court. Can you talk a little bit about that process?
Yeah, so the credible fear process is written into the law as an exception to expedited removal. So when Congress created this idea of expedited removal in 1996, the consensus at the time was that we should not be deporting people seeking asylum. And so Congress created a safety valve for expedited removal with the idea that most people would not have a credible fear of persecution. And so they created this thinking it would not be used very much. That turned out not to have been largely accurate as the wave of asylum seekers began arriving at the US border 10 years ago. But broadly speaking, the credible fear interview is carried out by an asylum officer. He determines or she determines whether or not you have what's known as a credible fear of persecution in your home country. This is an interview that lasts anywhere from 1 to 4 hours, depending on how complicated your case is. And at the end of it, the asylum officer says, either you have a credible fear of persecution or you don't. If you don't, you do have a right to appeal that to an immigration judge, just that question. But if you do, then you get taken out of expedited removal and placed into normal immigration court proceedings.
Okay, that makes sense. Thank you for sort of level setting so that, those of us who don't do this for our careers can follow along. Now let's kind of go back to the processing at Guantanamo Bay and if you can talk about how that interfaces with that sort of baseline, what you've called the normal process.
Yeah, so at Guantanamo Bay, again, the first people were, from all reports, people who had already been ordered removed. And we don't know of people who had not yet been removed who were ordered removed who were taken to Guantanamo Bay. So those are people who either had orders of expedited removal issued against them or people who had been through the immigration court process and lost and who had final orders of removal. So at that point, just when you've been ordered removed, that doesn't mean you're instantly going to be removed. There needs to be a country that will take you, and there needs to be, a plane that they can put you on. So for Venezuelans, the challenge has been for quite some time deporting people to Venezuela, a government that understands quite clearly that its reticence to accept the return of its own nationals is about one of the only bits of leeway or leverage that it has over the United States. Because, the United States under multiple previous administrations, including the Biden administration, has really wanted to deport people to Venezuela. And Venezuela, very aware of this, also really wants the United States to lift sanctions and to change its own policies. So as a sort of basic realpolitik has said, well, we're just not going to take our own people. If you don't want to, I don't care that you don't want the United States. Well, we don't want you to do what you're doing to us. So this is our leverage over you. And so what the Trump administration has done is they have sort of browbeaten Venezuela through a combination of various different things into accepting some deportation flights. The Biden administration briefly got the same from Venezuela. Then Venezuela broke its end of the deal. And, here with the Trump administration, it's similarly been on and off. Venezuela's taken a few flights here and there. But at one point, when President Trump revoked Chevron's license to get oil and gas in Venezuela, Venezuela said, okay, planes are off. I understand as of now, planes are back on, but it's still not been a huge number of planes. And so Guantanamo seemed to be where they wanted to send a bunch of Venezuelans to make this point. We're sending these gang members, the worst of the worst, to Guantanamo Bay. But they were all people who could have just been held in standardized detention centers. And then when they reached a deal with Venezuela, put on a plane there. There was absolutely no operational reason to do it other than public relations, as far as we can tell. But these were people who had already been ordered removed.
Okay. That's so interesting because I think most people don't understand the background of why Venezuelan immigrants in particular have become such a political football. And I want to ask you about that and what's going on with El Salvador. But first, let's take a quick ad break. And we're back. Okay, so you've been talking to us about Venezuela and Venezuelan migrants in this country who are facing so much stigma. And I guess I would like to understand, the administration talks a lot about Tren de Aragua, this gang, this Venezuelan gang, and it kind of reminds me of MS-13, which we heard about in the first Trump administration, things that are real, but would appear to me to be sort of a label that's slapped generically on all migrants from a specific background. How real is that perception?
I think that is a very real concern. Tren de Aragua is a real street gang. It has its origins in Venezuela and has spread a little bit around the surrounding region as the Venezuelan diaspora really exploded in the last decade. For people not aware, about 1 in 4 people have left Venezuela in the last decade. Around this time, around 8 million people have left the country as it sort of collapsed over the last decade. And with that has gone, yes, some of the criminal element, because there are, quite frankly, it's not very great. There's not a lot of money in extorting an incredibly impoverished population in Venezuela. So this gang has expanded and has gone to other countries in the region. It doesn't have anywhere near the power level that MS-13 had at its height. MS-13, as a transnational criminal organization, held enormous amount of power in El Salvador and in other countries in the region, really had a vice grip on civil society and really on everyone in the region in a way that Tren de Aragua, from all reports, has not had that level of success. And MS-13 ended up with a larger footprint in the United States than Tren de Aragua because MS-13 is an American street gang. It was actually founded in Los Angeles in the 1980s. And then as a result of the Reagan administration and the war on drugs, we deported a bunch of LA gangbangers to El Salvador right as a civil war was ending and there was a huge power vacuum, and they ended up taking over and really causing huge amounts of damage as a result of our deportations, essentially, which is don't need to get into that history there. But broadly speaking, it is a real street gang. There are members in the United States. Nobody's denying that. What there isn't is like any kind of the level of extreme power that the Trump administration keeps pretending that this street gang has. Yes, it is a serious problem in a few small areas in the United States, maybe a block here and there that is under control, like the Crips and the Bloods would occasionally have control of a street in a U.S. city. Tren de Aragua might have control of an apartment complex here and there, same as any street gang. But they are not the kind of like large-scale threat that some of these bigger organizations are, or like something like the Sinaloa cartel or the Gulf cartel, which has, or the CJNG cartel, Cartel Jalisco Nueva Generación, which has literally paramilitary forces with, machine guns, drones, and they're engaged in small-scale guerrilla warfare, in southern Mexico right now. Nothing like that when we're talking about Tren de Aragua.
Okay, so then let's talk about the proclamation that Trump made on Saturday, or Friday, really, about Tren de Aragua.
Yeah, so this proclamation, on its face, seems to be rather at odds with the facts as you've described them, right? So after describing correctly that Tren de Aragua is a designated foreign terrorist organization, although that is designated by the president, so that's trivially true. It describes that it's engaged with various cartels, and then it says TDA is closely aligned with and indeed has infiltrated the Maduro regime, including its military and law enforcement apparatus. Is that true?
So I don't want to pretend to be a expert on Tren de Aragua or on it, but certainly it is true that many of these sort of larger criminal organizations have tendrils that have reached out to corrupt politicians. This is true for pretty much any large gang. They pay off the people who they need to pay off to make their money. That doesn't mean that they are arms of the state. There are certainly paramilitary organizations around the world that are arms of various different states because they are actually governed by these larger organizations. So one good example is the former president of Honduras is currently sitting in federal prison because he essentially was running narco trafficking out of the presidential residence and ordering, hits and drug deals while as president. That is not an allegation that the United States is making here in regards to Tren de Aragua. There's no allegations that Maduro is personally controlling their actions and ordering them to come here. Now, President Trump seems to falsely believe that Venezuela has deliberately done this. Now, this goes back a while. On the campaign trail, he said Venezuela was emptying out their insane asylums and their prisons to send people here. And they have asserted repeatedly his belief that nations are deliberately sending their criminals here. There is no evidence of that, genuinely. No public evidence of any of that whatsoever. Just a few sort of rantings by him on the campaign trail. And that appears to have infected this declaration, this belief that they are doing this on purpose without really much evidence presented at all.
Well, so can you talk us through why it's important legally for Tren de Aragua to be sort of a hybrid nation state, right? Why does the Trump administration need it to be true, and you can hear the air quotes about that, that this gang and the government are coterminous and they are one?
Yeah, so the Alien Enemies Act of 1798 has really two primary prerequisites before it can be used. First, there must be either a declared war or a predatory invasion or predatory incursion into the United States. And then second, that declared war must be against, or the predatory incursion or invasion must be carried out by a, quote, foreign nation or government. So here, Trump is making two arguments. First, he is arguing that the migration of Venezuelans to the border and Tren de Aragua and crossing the United States and carrying out criminal activities in here are engaged in an invasion or a predatory incursion. And second, he is arguing that Tren de Aragua is a foreign nation or government under the law. Though I will note, he doesn't actually say that in the Alien Enemies Act declaration. There's no point where he says, I declare that they are a foreign government. He just describes it at various points as this hybrid criminal state, which is, again, they didn't even dot the I's and cross the T's properly.
Okay, so what you're saying is, for the purpose of this law, Trump has to kind of treat these migrants as an invading army, and we've seen other courts talk about that. There's a judge, Judge Ho in the Fifth Circuit is very hot to make it clear, I think mostly because he wants to be on the Supreme Court, that you can treat undocumented migrants as invaders, in a word-like footing. That's for the purposes of birthright citizenship.
Yeah, he's analogized them directly to an invading army for purposes of excluding them under the 14th Amendment.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
And if you look at how this law has been invoked in the past, it's been during actual wars. The War of 1812, World War II is sort of very prominent examples here where the United States was attacked by a foreign nation and government. And of course, if you look at 1789, do you think the people in 1789 would have believed that a sort of a criminal gang, of which there were certainly criminal gangs in 1789, or pirates, let's say bands of people sort of outside of a standard nation state framework, would they have been considered foreign nations or governments? I think none of them would have said that. I think that's an absurd thing to claim.
Yeah, very clearly. But so he needs to do this so that he can treat these people as invaders. And can we talk about what happened with these flights of purported invaders being sent to El Salvador?
Yeah. So the ACLU got wind that they were going to do this. Advocates and lawyers noticed that their clients, their Venezuelan clients, were suddenly having their court hearings canceled and were being brought to a detention center in Texas and told, we're going to be deporting you soon. And so everybody knew, with the Alien Enemies Act having been reported that President Trump was going to invoke it, that it seemed that was what was going to happen. So they filed suit on Saturday early in the morning. And later that afternoon, Chief Judge Boasberg of the D.C. District Court held a hearing and eventually ruled, after some of the planes had already taken off, that the Trump administration's invocation of the Alien Enemies Act was unlawful and that people should turn the planes around and not transfer anybody over to any custody. He did note, however, that if people were just being deported under normal immigration law proceedings, that is, if they had prior orders of removal, they had already gotten final orders of removal like we talked about before, that would not violate it because those people could still be deported under normal immigration law. But he said, if you're using the Alien Enemies Act, you've got to turn these planes around and you have to not transfer these people. And that did not happen. The planes did not turn around. They landed. They just charged everybody. Everyone was deplaned. And so there is a hearing this is March 17th at 5 p.m. as to what's going to happen next in this. And then the question will come down to, when did this order come down? What were the status of the planes? And a lot will go forward from there.
Yeah. So can you explain why America would want to send these people to El Salvador? Do we want the Salvadoran government to hold them so that we don't have to? Do we want this to be, pursuant to deportation back to Venezuela, like the way we did in Honduras or Gitmo? What's going on here? What's kind of the endpoint of this maneuver?
Like with Gitmo, the endpoint seems to be public relations. President Nayib Bukele, the president of El Salvador, who has very good relationships with the Trump administration, was there with camera crews, with the army, and a spectacle. He is a very prominent poster on X, Elon Musk's social media platform, and Bukele, posted in response to a New York Post article about the court order. He said, "Oopsie, too late," in response to it. And then Marco Rubio retweeted that. So it gives you some sense of this is very much Bukele working in conjunction with the Trump administration for media purposes, because his entire thing is he essentially used a state of exception to crack down on MS-13 in his country. And while you can certainly criticize, and many people have, the authoritarian ways in which that crackdown was carried out, there is a reality that it did at least temporarily break the power of MS-13 in the country. And so a lot of people have looked to Bukele and that example and said, well, this is what we have to do for crime elsewhere. Just crack down, get rid of people's civil rights, lock them in, throw away the key. Of course, El Salvador is a country about the size of New Jersey. It is a much smaller population than the United States. There are a lot of very different issues, obviously, and what works in El Salvador is not necessarily something that would work in the United States or should work in the United States, given the civil rights issues. But this is very much part and parcel of this law and order message. But it's really crucial to understand, though, unlike with Guantanamo Bay, where everyone there had already been ordered deported, about half the people that were sent to El Salvador had not. Many of them had upcoming hearings. Many of them have said vehemently, up and down, we are not members of Tren de Aragua. You have made a mistake. One person, Lindsay Kozlowski, who is the legal director at an organization known as Immigrant Defenders in San Diego, says that one of her clients was an LGBT asylum seeker from Venezuela who was a tattoo artist. And he had a couple of tattoos on him because he's a tattoo artist. He's tattooed. And ICE said, we think these are gang tattoos. We think, therefore, you are a member of Tren de Aragua. He was a Venezuelan with tattoos. Therefore, that equals, in ICE's mind, Tren de Aragua. And he said, that's ridiculous. I'm not. I can show you. I can tell you, like, this tattoo was a buddy of mine made it at the tattoo shop. It was like a practice piece. And he was going to argue to a judge, this is a mistake. I deserve asylum. I'm not a member of a gang. And he had his hearing set for Monday, the 17th, today, as we're recording this. But he was put on a plane, seemingly, and sent to El Salvador and is, from all reports, currently languishing in a Salvadoran prison where Bukele is reportedly going to subject him to hard labor. He has gotten zero due process. Zero.
Right. So that's kind of my question, because when Bukele's tweet talked about the no idle hands policy, which makes it sound like this is basically a slave colony, this notoriously violent prison where they unloaded these prisoners and shaved their heads on camera and set it to this like grotesque movie theme soundtrack, which is what Bukele tweeted and multiple members of the U.S. government retweeted. But my question is, if these people are they going to be serving sentences in this jail? Is this pursuant? Are they going to be held in this, facility and then returned to Venezuela, or is that just where they're going to be held right now?
Absolutely nobody knows. And that's terrifying. No one knows what legal basis they're doing this. No one has ever done this before. We have never, ever seen someone deported to another country and ordered to serve a prison sentence there in that other country. They have clearly not violated anything under Salvadoran law because they've maybe never been in El Salvador. Right. And these are people who, many of them have not even have been found to have violated U.S. law. They have not even been ordered deported. They've just been subject to this Alien Enemies Act thing. And some of them had active pending asylum claims. And yet we have somehow sent them to serve hard labor in a prison in another nation for what? And this is why people should be outraged. If they can do that to them, think about who else they could do that to. That's something that should scare everybody.
Yeah, it is definitely terrifying. And as far as I have been able to tell, and I want to ask the question, to you in your experience, the last time that the Alien Enemies Act was invoked during World War II, and it was invoked in shameful fashion, right? And obviously German nationals, Japanese nationals, Italian nationals here were summarily rounded up and held in concentration camps for the duration of the war. But it appears that all of those folks at least got some level of due process, right? It was probably, not exactly the fairest thing on earth, but they at least appeared before, some kind of alien enemies board or something like that. And it looks like there's no process here. And I guess I'm just asking, am I right on both halves of those assumptions?
Yeah, you're completely right. Again, during an active ongoing war, when many Americans died, we still gave people subject to the Alien Enemies Act some process. It wasn't a lot of process. Most of the time people couldn't really challenge decisions, but there was still a board that heard cases of people subject to it, that allowed people to present evidence and say that they had been unfairly subject to it. There was process. Trump has done none of that. And not only that, he is stating he doesn't even need the Alien Enemies Act. In a legal brief that he filed with the DC Circuit and in statements that have really been echoed by the White House press team afterwards, they are declaring that even if the Alien Enemies Act doesn't apply, he has an inherent constitutional authority to summarily remove anyone who's part of Tren de Aragua, with no rights, no due process.
Is that because he basically says, I get to make all national security decisions and they're unreviewable by any court?
I mean, basically, yes. Of course, he can't cite to anything because that proposition is completely inimical to anything that has ever been done in the United States. It's just, it's ultra vires. The non-lawyer speak, he's making this up. This is not something that has ever been said that any president has ever tried to assert. During, of course, the war on terror, President Bush alleged that he could, hold Al-Qaeda terrorists at Guantanamo Bay in violation of the Geneva Convention and, not have to follow any U.S. laws. And even the Supreme Courts there said, no, you have to put them through normal laws. Even, again, accused Al-Qaeda terrorists held at Guantanamo Bay who had never been in the United States had rights. And Trump is saying, I don't think these people have any. That gives you some sense of how extreme this assertion is.
All right. Well, we have more of the interview with Aaron Reichlin-Melnick that we will air on Friday's show. Thank you to Aaron for coming on the show, and this was great.
Okay, we will be back on Thursday with written content, as always, and we will see you here on Friday. Thanks, guys.
Law and Chaos Podcast is a production of Raise Up to Media, LLC, is intended solely as entertainment, does not constitute legal advice, and does not form an attorney-client relationship. This show is researched and written by Liz Dye and produced by Bryce Blankenagel. Law and Chaos Pod, copyright Raise Up to Media, LLC, all rights reserved.